I'm Bob Bellhouse, and I'm a professional woodturner. I've lived here in Pound Ridge for about 20 years now with my wife Harriet. We love this place. One of the great things about Pound Ridge is there's plenty of wood for me to work on. A lot of the time I find wood by the side of the road and use it to make the pieces that I do. My work, I've been doing this for about 5 years now. It's started out as a hobby, and now I've become a professional. I'll tell you later about how you could get my pieces if you're interested. I work with local woods, but I also use exotic woods for some of the pieces, which I can show you later. It takes about anywhere from 10 to 20 hours to make a piece, depending upon how complicated it is or how large it is or some of the techniques that have to be used. And I do all that in my workshop, which is right here in my home in Pound Ridge, down in the basement. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for about 5 years, and one of the things that I've really enjoyed about it is learning from masters. And I take great pride in that I've been able to visit with and work with some of the really terrific woodturners in the United States and in Canada, and learn from them. And I think as a group, woodturners are very generous in sharing their information. And many woodturners have a particular style that they like to do, or a particular technique that they are known for. And I try to incorporate what I've learned into my pieces. What's particularly interesting for me when I see a piece of wood is to think about what that piece of wood, what that chunk of log could be, and how is the grain operating inside that wood. What can I expect to find when I start to cut into it, and how can I use that to best advantage? In fact, it can easily take an hour or more just to be thinking about what a particular section of a tree might become and how I can take advantage of all of that grain pattern and coloration that exists inside of a tree. Once I've made the decision of what to do, then the process of initially a rough cutting just to get a general shape of what's needed, and then comes the really interesting part of the detailed work and trying to get very, very fine, smooth cuts into the wood without damaging a finger, because you're working with very, very sharp tools. I use tools, typically they're called gouges, and they're made out of high-speed steel, and they're razor sharp. They must be sharp in order to do the kind of cutting that I do. And that razor sharp piece of steel is held very closely with your hands up against a piece of wood that's spinning anywhere from 500 to 1500 RPM or more. So you've got to be careful. You've got to be Zen-like focused on this. If you lose concentration, then you either are going to have an accident, or at the very least damage the piece of wood and have to start over again. Or one of the good things about woodworking is if you do make a mistake trying to make a piece this big, and you make a mistake and screw up the wood, you then make a piece that's this big because you cut away the mistakes and nobody ever sees them again. In addition to the gouges, I use something called skew chisels, which are kind of tricky, but if you use them correctly, by the time you finish using a skew chisel, you really don't need sandpaper anymore, because it is glass-like smooth surface of the wood achieved simply with the use of a metal tool against rapidly spinning wood. Safety is really important. It's a very dusty, dirty, not dirty, but there's a lot of flying dust and chips of wood. So I need to protect myself, certainly my eyes with safety glasses, sometimes a full face shield depending upon the kind of wood that I'm working with, and a mask to protect against dust inhalation. And I've got dust collection systems and other things to try to keep me safe. I also have a lot of light on my work. It's important to be able to see the detail, and maybe as I get older it becomes more and more necessary to have light. So it's a very well lit area. Everything is arranged so it's convenient for me. My tools are right at hand, and I kind of kind of get into the zone when I'm downstairs working, and I'll work for maybe 3 hours at a time. After that, I tend to start to lose concentration. Beyond 3 hours, or at most 4 hours, I need to take a break and go do something else. I'll start a piece and get halfway through it and have to come back the next week to finish it. And I will sometimes not really finish a piece, but put it aside so that later I can do the final finishing step on 6 pieces at once, rather than try to put the polish on each individual piece as I finish. So that's kind of an overview of the process. Wood turning has become more and more popular in the United States, certainly since the 70s. And it's still in transition and still a very popular craft for people to practice and get good at. Styles are changing. Now we see more and more sculpted pieces and coloration, meaning paint or dyes or surface texture. Most of my work does not involve that. Most of my work is simply the grain of the wood being exposed in a shape that's pleasing to the eye and gentle to the touch. Occasionally I'll do a little surface texturing, but that's more of an accent than the main feature of the piece that I'm doing. So what do we make? We make bowls. Everybody starts out making a bowl, and I've made a lot of bowls, but then it gets more interesting as you move into doing what we call a hollowed form. So all of this starts with a piece of a tree. And as I mentioned, I often will find an interesting piece of wood lying by the side of the road, or if it's an exotic wood, I may purchase it online. This is a piece of maple here. And what we do is there are 3 basic shapes or things that I'm interested in making. Bowls. Everybody starts out making bowls, and I'm no exception. I make bowls. This is a piece of ambrosia maple, a local piece of wood, beautiful chocolate colored against the pale of the maple. Very simple shape. And then from bowls, people often go into making what's called a hollowed form. So this is like a bowl with a top on it. And the trick here is to hollow out this object. This is about 3/16 of an inch thick, all the way around. And the hollowing, the removing of the wood inside that piece to make it light, is done through that little opening on the top, and it requires special tools and special techniques. And again, as I mentioned, I'm always trying to get the grain, to show off the grain in the wood. This piece of black ash has a lovely grain pattern. Different types of hollowed forms. This is still a hollowed form. You can't see it, but it's very, very light because I have been able to hollow out the inside of this square bottle, remove all of that wood, and make it very, very light. And this could be used as a bud vase. I have a way of waterproofing pieces. I generally don't waterproof the inside of a piece because of the extra effort involved, but there are techniques to do that, and on request I'll waterproof the inside so they can actually put water and put a live flower in there. This is an example of a hollowed form which is done in an exotic wood. This is done in African blackwood and a wood called Thuya burl, which comes from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and this African blackwood comes from Central America. That's the wood that clarinets and oboes are made from, this wood right here. It's very, very dense, very hard, very smooth. And when you work with it, when you're shaving away this shape, the room is filled with the smell of chocolate. This wood smells like chocolate. It's not the chocolate tree or the cocoa tree, but it sure does smell like it. And then continuing hollowed forms, this is an open hollowed form, so the top is not closed, a little maple wood goblet. The final thing that I do, and probably what I do most of, is making small boxes. So a box like that, which I call a kiss box, opens and is useful for putting small things in there. My wife uses these to keep her earrings or a ring in at the end of the night. But people also have used them as a presentation box for engagement rings. I have a way of, you can mount an engagement ring on the inside and it becomes a nice little way to present that. These are tricky for two reasons. One is obviously getting that thin tapered shape. Again, very, very sharp tools, razor sharp tools. This is spinning at around 1500 RPM. And I've got to support this piece of wood out here with my fingers on one side while I'm shaving away wood on the other side. So it's not a time to get distracted. The other tricky thing about these little boxes is the joint, the edge right there, that is about a 1/16 of an inch and lets the top sit nicely on the bottom. So that's kind of the basic forms that we do. There is another form which you might be more familiar with called spindles. And if you have a staircase with wooden railings or a deck with wooden railings, those vertical pieces, the balusters, are done on a lathe. And that's called spindle work, which I don't do. Generally, that tends to be architectural. But the lathe will do a lot of different shapes. It'll do the bowls, the hollowed forms, the boxes, the spindle forms. Depending upon the size of the lathe and the power of the lathe and how heavy it is, it's really important that a lathe be heavy so that if the wood is slightly out of balance, the lathe doesn't bounce all around the room and go walking all around the room. On a lathe of any given size, you can do all of those shapes that I just mentioned. My lathe tends to be on the little larger size, which allows me to do large pieces, as well as the very tiny ones like the little kiss box that I just showed you. If I had a smaller lathe, then I wouldn't be able to do the large pieces. I'm very honored to have been selected to display my work at several of the local art shows, including the South Salem Art Show and the Art Show of Bedford, where I've been for 3 years now. And it's always a joy to put my pieces on display and have conversations with folks about them and talk about how they're produced and what I do, and of course offer them up for sale as well. And working with the art shows, a lot of that money goes to charity, which is a wonderful way to kind of put back into the system. Although I don't have a website, I can be reached at bob.bellhouse@gmail.com, and I would love to hear from anyone who's interested in either learning more about wood turning or in learning about the pieces that I have, even if they're interested in having a piece custom made, which I can often do. For folks, for example, who have lost a tree on their property and want to have some memento of that tree, I can come by and take a piece of wood and make something of it for you. I'd like to invite you to come down to my workshop here in the basement, and I'll show you how I take a chunk of wood like this and turn it into a piece of art like that. This is where I do all of my wood turning. Here's my lathe. It's a Nova DVR lathe, able to handle large pieces, small pieces. I've got a tiny little bowl on here right now that I've been working on. I might later work on this piece, which is African black wood. I'm going to put a little ship carving on the side of it, but that's a wonderful little piece of wood to work with. And then sometimes I'll do a larger chunk like this piece of spalted beech. And for each of these pieces, you can see large or small, there's a variety of tools to use, there's a variety of ways to mount them on the lathe. The basic techniques of shaving the wood off are pretty much the same, but you know, initially I'm taking fairly rough cuts to get rid of wood really fast, and as I get down to the final stages of something like this, I'm taking very, very, very fine cuts just to get that last little smooth edge. What I'm looking for is that the shape not only looks correct, and I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but this actually tilts down into the center. So it not only looks correct, but if you run your hands over it, it feels right. It feels as it should. There are no flat spots, there are no bulges, it's perfectly uniform, and it just it just feels right. That's what I'm striving for. I've got all of the tools I need pretty much right here. I have my sharpening equipment that I use about every 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to sharpen a tool. I've got my gouges. I probably use this one tool here. 75% of the work that I do is probably done with this one tool, which used to be about that long, and as I sharpen it, it gets shorter and shorter, and you eventually get to the point where you've got to replace the tool because you've used up all the steel, the high-speed steel there. But in addition to this, for special purposes, I probably have 20 other tools, ranging all the way down to things like this. So you can see the difference. Surprisingly, I can use this tool on fine detail work as well as the larger pieces, but this obviously is only for small detailed work. I wear dust protection all the time. I found these little surgical masks to be comfortable for hours on end, and they keep the dust out. But I also have dust collection equipment positioned right behind the lathe so that 90% of the dust and chips fly away from me and get sucked away into a big storage bag over there that I empty out once a week. And then I've got other little things that are kind of interesting, and I'll bring this down here so you can see it. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is a dental drill. It spins at around 50,000 RPM, which is slower than dentist drills. But I use this for very fine detail, and I also use this to sign my name on the bottom of the pieces. I write my last name and the year in which I made the piece. So everything is handy, everything is nearby, everything is safe. I try to work on multiple pieces at the same time, because when I get to a certain stage, the wood needs to rest. It needs to kind of adjust the shape as it dries out, or as the internal tension of the wood is released by me hollowing it out. The outside shape will change slightly, so I have to go back and reshape the outside after I've hollowed out the inside. So at any given time, I might be working on 5 or 6 pieces. So for anyone who's interested in purchasing one of my pieces or talking about a custom piece, having a custom piece made, I would ask you to please contact me at bob.bellhouse@gmail.com. I don't have a website. I found I was spending more time keeping the website up to date than I was making wooden pieces, which is my passion. So the best way to contact me is through my email address, and then I can send you a catalog of the work that I have on hand, or talk to you about a custom piece.
You're watching Lewisboro Community Television, Channel 20.